Well, thank you again. Good afternoon, folks. I don't want to take too much of your time because I did get the honor of being able to address the full group earlier. But I just want to add to what has been presented already in relation to this concept and how we should understand and deal with it. So Islamophobia, just to confirm, is racism. It has all the characteristics of racism. It is also a mobilization of anti-Muslim hatred. So it's not static. It grows, it develops, it morphs depending on opportunity structures. And in that context, we have Islamophobia, which is structural, cultural, institutional, and systemic. So structural in the sense of our education, employment, housing, health outcomes. We just look at the patterns, look at the groups who are affected by the problems faced within those sectors. And it is a function of poverty, disadvantage. Half of all British Muslims live in 20% of the poorest regions of the country. So that lack of mobility, being trapped in inner city declining spaces with limited resources is an issue of the structural reality of anti-Muslim racism at some level. But of course, we know that there is a spectrum of outcome with regards to mobility. So there are the upwardly mobile Muslims who are projecting a different kind of Muslimness, often in opposition to those left behind Muslims, as it were. Now, this is interesting in terms of framing. Now, the APPG worked hard. I contributed to it. I gave oral evidence and I wrote about it. And yet there is still huge resistance. The Labour Party, the Greens, the Mayor of London, various boroughs of London have all adopted it. But obviously, the Tory Party are doing everything in their power not to. And that's obviously a reflection of many different things going on. The fact of the accusations of Islamophobia that are not being addressed, although there are interesting leaks going on at the moment around other complaints that have just been ignored. And obviously the attempt to try and reinvent Islamophobia by the Tory party in terms of actually we don't like your definition, we'll define it ourselves and find our own experts. We just won't ignore, or we'll just completely ignore the fact that you spoke to 800 organizations and individuals and spend all this time engaging with communities to establish it. And so this leads to this denial of Islamophobia that is, again, institutional, structural, cultural. And the Commission for Countering Extremism is also embroiled in this space where Islamophobia, which we know from our understanding of the problems of radicalization, when we talk to young people who are affected by these issues, that Islamophobia is real. And actually, if you look at the Twitter campaigns of Islamic State, they use Islamophobic sentiment to lure people in and then to take them over the edge through ideology. Islamophobia is a recruiting sergeant for the radicalizing forces that take our vulnerable young people and do with them what they do. So there are these concerns. Now, it's also interesting when we think about social research. Now, this is what I do on a daily basis. And it's interesting that over the last 20 years, we know everything about Muslims. We know where they live. We know where they work. We know what they eat. We know what television they watch. We know what they wear. And yet, for some reason, we still find Muslims a mystery. And we spend various efforts to try and continue to research, trying to work out the tipping points of extremism, radicalization, inclusion, exclusion, as if we don't have enough of this research going on, not just here, but across the whole Western European space. And in this space also, we think about Islam and Muslims in different categories around the progressive, the regressive dynamic, but also the mysterious moderate Muslim. Most Muslims are moderate, and yet somehow they're not there, and we have to find them or create them. And this leads to the sort of process of the professional Muslims who are engaged in the Islamophobia industry. So the now enlightened and self-realized ex-radicals are now projected by the state as the exemplars of all that is good about being Muslim, and you should emulate them and reach out to their value systems. But a lot of those individuals are still deeply troubled in many other ways, and I don't think it's entirely appropriate to have this kind of tokenistic approach. But then, of course, tokenism and diversity is a thing, for sure. And then this Islamophobia industry that is fueled by external forces who mobilize, fund, support think tanks, institutions, press, etc., to continue to produce this sort of mill of Islamophobic sentiment on a daily basis. I mean, I don't know how many times Miqdad Rosi has to complain to Ipso to get articles taken down, as if as if they don't learn. They do it again and again and again on a daily basis. Every day, it's the hyper-normalization of Islamophobia that we see in media and politics, which makes it even more dangerous and sinister. So I think, just to end, I'd like to think about solutions. And I think the challenge here is the need to reclaim these concepts. You know, who defines what it is to be the Muslim is not being done often by Muslims themselves. It's done by external forces and interests who would wish to shape a certain type of Muslimness in a way that is seen as acceptable or normalized. But that is obviously problematic because it takes attention away from agency, and as well as the fact that there are internal struggles that need to be had. Also, this idea of Islamophobia. Now, the Islamophobes would want to suggest that Islamophobia is deeply problematic because the idea of a phobia is an irrational fear. Maybe we should be fearful of a religion that is violent and problematic and regressive, is what these Islamophobes would argue. But Islamophobia is not necessarily about the idea of the religion or the people who follow it. It's a much wider, overarching concept that has various different layers of meaning and application. And that's why it's going to take a great deal of effort for Muslims to own it so that they can engage with it in systematic terms. And finally, this notion of radicalization. It's good to be radical. It's healthy. It helps build change and introduces change into societal mechanisms. And I think that's also important. And that's why Talat was observing that young Muslims identify themselves as Muslims as a way to resist, as a way to mobilize their identities against the oppressive systems that keep them in check, as it were. And that's nothing problematic. That's nothing unhealthy about young people growing up and becoming self-aware. But it's also reflecting the nature of some of the deep challenges out there. And I think there's still a long way to go to get to move forward with various necessary steps here. And I think a lot of it is about communities reaching out to each other much more. Often what we forget is that Muslims are often much more divided within than they are without. And we don't talk to each other, because somebody's trouser length is too low or too high. And it goes on and on and on. And it's deeply problematic. And we need to rise above it to succeed. Thank you.